Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from all around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture, and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. We're at the last few weeks of summer, and I'm thrilled. It's been a long one and a hot one, and I've hated every second of it. Also, the World of Warcraft expansion comes out this evening, as of the published date of this episode, so I will be lost to the battle for Azeroth for the next few weeks. I've even booked the week off of work, which is just going to be great. And of course, you will still get your episode next week. I will just be slightly distracted for the rest of it, just on my computer all the time, getting significant eye strain like I've had all week. So it is quite nice that the weather's come back down, because not having to bake in my study whilst I act like a massive sweatlord in game is quite nice. But this week though, we are definitely not sweating with this monster. In fact, probably the opposite, where we're turning into icicles if we touch her. Yes, we are heading to Japan this week to look at the winter spirit, the Yuki-onna. The Yuki-onna are described as a yokai, or spirit in Japanese culture, who are the female personification of winter storms and, realistically, hypothermia. The condition of basically freezing to death, by the way. They are typically beautiful women with long white or dark hair, blue lips, wearing a white frost-covered kimono, left wandering alone in the snow. They, like many other yokai, are mentioned to have either no feet or make no footprints as they float over any surfaces. They're usually described as being young and having skin so pale that it's almost translucent. And whilst they are most typically seen in their white kimonos, they can also be found more scantily clad, and sometimes even completely naked. Interestingly, white kimonos are really significant, as they are considered burial kimonos in Japanese culture, and to see a woman wearing one was uncommon and significantly taboo. So what makes these monsters possibly one of the deadliest monsters of the Japanese winter? Well, as I said, they're the personification of winter storms, and they have power over any kind of snowy situation. They can turn into blizzards, snowstorms, avalanches and icicles at the blink of an eye, which is also how they get around. It's said that the Yuki-onna can freeze anyone with a glance, and if you freeze around her, she will suck away your life force with her wintry breath, almost like a weird vampiric method. You also can't ignore her, otherwise she will push you off a cliff or bury you within a snowdrift. In some stories, Yuki-onna can be intentionally vicious, and brings in snowstorms to trap travellers and use their icy breath to leave them as frost-coated corpses, or even lead them into danger so they just die of exposure. Sometimes they can also be found with children, and when the person goes to take the child from her for safety, they are frozen in place. This works especially well on parents searching for lost children in the mountains. The Yuki-onna can also just walk into your home, blowing in the door with a gust of wind to kill residents in their sleep from the cold, although it is debated as to whether you have to invite her in first, again, kind of like a vampire. They are, though, sometimes known to be merciful, letting victims go if they showed her any kind of kindness or love. There are a few differing accounts as to what their preferred victims are, sometimes with them being children who stay outside in the cold too long, where the Yuki-onna steals them away and eats their livers specifically. Apparently it retains the heat after death. But most commonly, it's usually men who venture into the snowy wilderness and get caught up with our monster of the week. Yuki-onna are always described as women, and sometimes as even succubi, the temptation demons from religious stories, as whilst they are yokai, they are sometimes known to seduce men, marry, and even have children with them. They can also drain their life force through sex, or even something as small as a kiss, and they can sometimes even be found with snow children when discovered, which are basically mini Yuki-onnas and are also usually female. They also had the power to turn into normal women, but the only way you could tell them apart is by their unnatural white hair, which of course is very uncommon in most Asian countries, but especially in Japan, as well as their seemingly never-ending beauty, as they would be as magnificent as the day you met them, even as you age to an elderly person. They were perfectly capable of living a completely normal life, away from their freezing cold roots. Speaking of these mountainous regions, where are we talking about? We are talking about the northern prefectures of Japan, and specifically the Tohoku region. This region of Japan gets more snowfall than anywhere else in the country, and has 28 mountains to its name within its massive range. The weather up in these mountains is horrendous. It's immensely cold, going down to as low as -20 in the winter months. That's Celsius, not Fahrenheit, sorry Americans. The Yuki-onna lives within these mountain ranges, hiding out and waiting for another stupid adventurer to come her way. We believe that the Yuki-onna is formed by the usual means that you can imagine, a woman being left to die in the snow. They can generally be vengeful of the people that left them there, or they can just kind of haunt the area. Another telling though is that they are the snow itself, embodying the Japanese belief in the elements being alive, and the weather, sun and moon activating a kind of consciousness, which explains some of their oddest yokai that we'll cover in other episodes. Whilst we think that they eat children's livers and sometimes whole bodies of adult men in some versions, we're not actually sure if they eat at all. We do know, however, that they can reproduce with normal humans, but it's not known whether there's a way to actually kill the Yuki-onna. They do tend to go away in the warmer months, so at least then you can be free to explore as you please. But now, on to etymology. Yuki-onna is of course a Japanese word, which is split into two word meanings. So we have yuki, which means snow, and onna, which means woman. So literally the word means snow woman. I'm sorry to say it's not a particularly interesting one this week, I'm afraid, but I do like the literalness of Japanese, and actually how easy sometimes it is to pronounce. I appreciate it. Their history though is interesting, and I'm excited to tell you some Yuki-onna stories. There are some really good ones in here. But we know that the Yuki-onna goes back to at least 1336 AD, which actually isn't that old for a Japanese monster. But we do believe that this was most likely around beforehand. This is because the first mention of these is within a poem by the poet Soji, called Soji's Tales from Various Provinces from 1685, which is much later, where he talks about the very established character of a Yuki-onna while staying in the northwest region of Japan. He gives us the widely accepted description of the Yuki-onna for the first time, and this was followed by differing descriptions and stories about this monster from all of the different regions of Japan. So I'll tell you some. In one telling, a Yuki-onna would come to visit an old couple on a snowy night to warm herself by the ori, which is a fire pit in the floor. Much later in the night, the Yuki-onna would leave, and the old man would attempt to stop her when he noticed that she was absolutely freezing, and then before his eyes, she turned into a whirl of snow that left through the chimney. Another story tells of a blizzard and the Yuki-onna standing in it hugging a child. She would ask people passing by to hug the child as well, but as they did, the child would become heavier and heavier until the person would be covered in snow and freeze to death. If you refused to hug it, you would be shoved down into a valley. How nice! There was a version of this story that a warrior hugged the child with a blade in his mouth that took the brunt of the cold. And once the hug was over, the Yuki-onna gave him treasures and made him physically very strong as a reward. My favourite story though is of the woodcutter and the Yuki-onna, written by Lafcadio Hearn, where there were two woodcutters, the young Minokichi and the old Masaku. One winter's night, they weren't able to get home due to a snowstorm and they stayed in a local hut. Minokichi woke up to find a beautiful white-clothed woman breathing over Masaku, who was frozen and dead. She approached the man but hesitated because of how beautiful he was, and then said, "I will not kill you because you are young and beautiful, but you must not tell anyone about this, and if you do, I will kill you." Many years later, Minokichi met a beautiful woman called Oyuki, and if you remember the etymology for this, it tells you enough, but it's also got the name of our monster in halfway there. He eventually marries and has 10 children with Oyuki, but he notices that she never ages, and they live happily for years. However, one night Oyuki comes in wearing white, and Minokichi remarks that she reminds him of a woman he once met, a very mysterious woman, and Oyuki stands up and screams that she was the woman, and he promised not to tell anyone about her. However, she couldn't deliver on her promise and kill him because of her children with him, and told him to look after them before she melted into a puddle on the floor. It's definitely a moral story that you shouldn't make promises you can't keep too, which I really like about this one. My last cool story is of an assassin who wanted to kill a shogun, a military rank in Japanese history. I had to get his maid to leave the house first. He told her that the shogun is planning to start a war and that she has to tell the others in the household to prepare to leave, and that his brother was waiting for her to escort her away from the house for her safety. However, when the maid goes outside to meet the brother, she is locked out and no one comes for her, so she freezes to death. She is transformed into the Yuki-onna and seeks revenge against the man who set her out. A lot of Yuki-onna stories, though, are not only just based on, yes, it's cold outside and therefore you might die, but other morals too, such as trying to change social order, such as in this last story, or even getting with a spirit or supernatural being. And these usually came from mountain people, who believed that those who break the mountain taboos would be killed by mountain spirits. And of course, mounting a spirit might be breaking a taboo. Well, hey. Older stories about the Yuki-onna are usually just really sad. It's usually from people who, like childless old couples or single men in mountain villages, would hear the sound of a blizzard knocking on their door and fantasise that the thing they have longed for, such as a child or a wife, has finally come. It's said that after that they would live in happiness with what they longed for in fantasy, as fleeting as snow. In Japanese culture too, winter is also the season when the gods would come to visit the earth, and if you didn't pay respects, terrible things were destined to happen to you, even if that comes in the form of a snowy maiden trying to marry you, but is also ready to freeze you to death too. In reality, to debunk this one, it sounds like she is the personification of the threats of winter. Who knew? I haven't been saying it this entire time. A boogeyman, to anyone who thinks that treading the dangerous walk up to the mountains might be worth it. Although, you might turn out alright if you're the Yuki-onna's type. We do have a similar monster in European folklore with Jack Frost. Whilst he is the personification of winter and a spirit who can cause trouble with his icy powers, he definitely didn't try to bury people in snow till they freeze to death, or trick them into marrying them, only to reveal themselves as a monstrous demon spirit years later. I did cover Jack Frost as a holiday special a few years ago, so if you're interested in hearing more about the softer version of this spirit from European folklore, do go and check that out. But now let's move on to modern media. We actually have so much for the Yuki-onna specifically, which really surprised me, as they're really heavily referenced within video games and anime. So for art, have a look at the Yuki-onna by Sawaki Sushi, Yuki-onna illustration from Soji, and Yuki-onna by Toriyami Seiken, or there's Yuki-onna from Bakemono Noi from 1700. A lot of these don't have dates, and the authors and places where they're published are a bit shaky, but otherwise check out the independent art this week for some really cool icy ladies that have been made by younger and more modern artists. In movies, we have Akira Kurosawa's Dreams, The Snow Woman, Tales from the Dark Side the movie, and Kawaii. For TV, we have MythQuest, Ultraman, Return of Ultraman, Super Sentai, Akumeza 3, Bleach, Hell Teacher Nube, Goblin Slayer, Doraemon, Inuyasha, Monster Mizumi, Rosario plus Vampire, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Missions of Love, Yaiba, The Lil Bits, Yataman, Interviews with Monster Girls, Frankenfran, The Kindeshi Case Files, Case Closed, Ayakashi Triangle, The Ice Guy and His Cool Female Colleague, yes that's true, and Yurusei Yatsura. In video games, we have ones such as Yuki-onna, Cassette Beasts, Pokemon, Shin Megami Tensei, Heroes of Might and Magic, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest VI, Muramasa the Demon Blade, Nihon, Yokai Watch, Touhou Project, Yokai Hunter Shintaro, Shinobi, Flower Girl Knight, Ninja Shadow of Darkness, Ayakashi Romance Reborn, Sinko Paradise, Yodanji, and Senran Kagura. My book recommendation this week is for The Book of Yokai by Mike and Dylan Foster. It's a holy book of all creatures Japanese and is an absolute treasure trove for any Japanese folklorists, or if you're into any kind of demons and things like that from Japanese culture. As well as my usual, which is Yokai Attack, the Japanese Monster Survival Guide, and Yurei Attack, the Japanese Ghost Survival Guide by Hiroko Yoda, which are two of my favourite Japanese monster books, and she truly is a fantastic and fun author and is actually Japanese. It's always nice. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? I'm going to say no on this one, because I think this one is pretty well explained by the whole I don't want to die in a cold mountainscape thing. If it gives people some comfort to believe that a scary lady blowing on them kills them, rather than just the elements being a bit scary, then I guess that's what it is. But for me, it seems a bit far-fetched. But that's not to say I don't think this one is really cool. I love the idea of these beautiful snow maidens trying to convince men to be with them, and stealing their kids or their lives directly. The idea of a kimono-wearing traditional woman doing this is pretty cool, and I love the idea of what she looks like. I also really like the idea of snow spirits quite a lot, and the personification of winter, and the harsh reality of this type of weather in these rural and isolated places, where rumours of monsters causing these horrible but natural deaths are as believed in as the physical mountains themselves. It's a lovely balanced monster of how beautiful the winter is, but also how deadly it is to be out in it. And I think this one is a perfect boogeyman, as well as one that is just a little bit ridiculous and a little bit sexy all at once. But what do you think? Did the Yuki-onna freeze up families in Japan? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. It's literally the perfect monster to bring us into autumn, with this horrendous heat finally being over. I also knew nothing about this monster, so I hope you enjoyed learning about her as much as I did, especially with the presence that this has in Japanese folklore and within Japanese media as well. Next week, we are taking a much needed break from serious myth monsters, and we are heading on over to somewhere technically nowhere. But fictionally, we are taking the hobbits to Isengard. Yes, we are doing a Hobbit episode, even though we know they're fictional. Sue me, okay? I'm excited, and I love Lord of the Rings, okay? But we're bringing this to you next Thursday. I'm very excited. For now, thank you so much for listening, though. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you're listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. And you can also find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals. They might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky. And I'll see you later, babes.